So just focusing on the battery.
You've noticed this forever on the internet site. That's the way I see the magnetic field. So, time goes on, and the next step John makes is working in Selmar, California, on this device right here called a G-field generator. I knew nothing about it. I read the patent. By looking at the patent, I had an intuition that the coils were wired wrong. So I just wound them my way. Well, to my surprise, this thing took off. I loaded it down and it took off. That was a 12-volt motor, a DC motor at the back of the device. And in this picture here, I'm showing Ike Muller, the Tesla switch. The G-field is sitting over here, and there was a bigger one over here. So you've got those 2 meters, and if those batteries on that side, and if you don't believe me, Rick will switch the batteries for you. I'll make them switch the batteries for you. You can watch it right in front of your face. That way you can't say, well, he wouldn't switch the batteries. Must be something wrong. Not everybody's going to be able to do this.
Yeah.
And not everybody's going to be able to understand what the machine, how the machine functions.
What I meant was you don't go to a book and say, okay, if it's this big, then you need this angle. Or...
There is no book on this, Pat.
Yeah.
And if anybody wrote the book, it's Tom Bearden.
Yeah.
So there's your credit again.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a man that meticulously searched night after night, night after night, night after night, through all kinds of reference material, and picked out one little bitty thing. It's hidden in some book somewhere. And he wrote about it. I mean, there's thousands of pages on Tom Bearden. And you read this stuff and you sort of scratch your head and you go, no electrical engineer will read it. Some physicists will read it and go, well, maybe the guy has an idea. But if I work on that, I'm not going to get any funding.
Yeah.
So Tom, all these years, has probably done it without very much funding, like everybody else.
The mathematicians were all chasing beauty at that time. For a long time, physics didn't want to even hear broken symmetry. That's what you had a Nobel Prize given in '57 to Li and Yang by actually proving certain interactions had broken symmetry. And Wu and her colleagues jumped on it and in less than a year proved it experimentally. It was such a revolution in physics that the very year that Wu and her colleagues proved it in February, they awarded the Nobel Prize in December that year to Li and Yang. Unprecedented speed of movement. Broken symmetries and all this bubbles we're talking about, instead of them all zeroing out, a broken symmetry gives you something that's not zero anymore. Or as Lee said, Noblest Lee, something virtual that you can't see and can't observe has become observable, that your instruments can see and measure. Something real has been born out of this pre-state that's virtually real but not observably real. So opposite charges, any dipole is already proven to be a broken symmetry, both theoretically and experimentally. We don't have to reprove that. This is not in electrical engineering. Just because we have these 2 charges in this position, they don't have to do anything, we don't have to do any work or anything. They constantly absorb these, what we call virtual photons, some of these bubbles. It's still not observable, but it makes a little change in the virtual state. Let's call that, in terms of mathematics, that would be a little differential of mass. It changes it to mass when it absorbs a photon. So that's a little dm1. The next one that's absorbed, and this goes going at an incredible rate, is a little dm2. And as these things continue being absorbed, the amount of mass is increasing differentially until that amount of mass, if it were converted back to energy, would be equal to the energy in an observable photon. That's what we call the quantum threshold, when a real observable photon can be born. Interestingly enough, as this thing roars up through the quantum threshold, this fierce buffeting that it's taking from all these particles of the vacuum being absorbed and beaten on it, kicks out that observable photon, collapses this excited state it had reached, and it starts all over again. I don't have to put in any energy, I don't have to do any work, but let the charge alone. This is what the classic guy would call this an electron, let's say. But if I put what the vacuum is doing, I had all these positive charges out here, so I had a whole big set of dipoles. And this set is radiating energy right out of this charge as real, honest-to-God photons in all directions, continuously. We now have our unfrozen waterfall that appears static. The field appears static. That's made of all these moving photons. But every part of that field, of that E field that's around here, for example, or of the potential that's around here, every part of it is moving at light speed and continually replaced by the photon coming along behind. Our problem is we have never decided to go in and find out how to extract the energy from this flow without messing with the North and South Pole or without killing the magnet or something. That should be the greatest problem that we're working on, exactly how to do that and not mess with the dipole. But the point is, it does produce energy from the vacuum. We don't have to go find a magic method of how to extract the energy from the vacuum. Nature tells us, and physics tells us, if we will look at the broken symmetry of the dipole. And we realize that the isolated charge in classical theory, in modern theory, is not an isolated charge at all. It's continually taking energy from the vacuum. It's a dipolarization, takes energy from the vacuum, pours it out as real energy. Our problem is to catch that real energy and not mess with the dipole and use it. Put a bucket out, catch a bucket full, and use the bucket to power the load. Don't go kill the dipole. And I've got a rotating generator here that's rotating around inside. And I crank the shaft out here. My job is to crank the shaft and turn it. I do mechanical energy input, and I have to do work because that's not what I want. I want a rotating magnetic field. So I have got to turn this shaft rotation mechanical energy into magnetic field energy. That requires work. That's why I have to crank the shaft. Once I get the magnetic field energy inside the generator, here are the lines going out from the generator to the whole power grid and feeding jillions of loads for 100 miles. Where does the magnetic energy go? It doesn't leave the generator. Doesn't go out on the lines, doesn't go power any loads. What it does inside the generator, it pushes the positive charges, and suppose this is the positive terminal, this is the negative. It pushes the positive charges this way up to that terminal, pushes the negative charges that way. It separates the charges, which does a little kink in the space out here and makes this plus and this minus. It makes that entire vast circuit dipolar, a dipole, a whole set of dipoles. All along here, we're extracting energy out of the vacuum, and it's pouring right on down the circuit. But the energy is not coming from what we crank the shaft of the generator from at all. Once we make the dipole, the energy is coming out of the vacuum to the dipole. Here's a dipole, here's a dipole, here's a dipole, here's a... everywhere dipoles. So we're having energy born in the circuit everywhere in this dipolarities from the vacuum. The biggest dipole is right here in the generator, making a potential between these two lines. As we potentialize this circuit, we create little force fields which push the electrons forward as current, push it through the load, and we dissipate some energy in the load. We lose some in the losses and so forth. But all of that is free, except we have now wired the generator in to the external circuit. Any current that moves this way has to move this way. So what we have is, so we make all the current that goes out in the losses and the loads, we make equal current to go back through all these separated charges that we paid such hard labor and money to separate, knock the charges out of there and destroy the dipole. The moment we destroy the dipole, we lose the flow of energy from the vacuum because now there's no broken symmetry. So we have to crank the shaft of the generator some more, turn it a little bit more, make some more magnetic field energy, so that we can make the charges move back apart and restore the dipole and cut the vacuum energy flow on again. Whereupon the silly circuit, this closed current loop circuit, uses half of everything it catches of free energy to destroy the dipolarity. So we pay the power company to engage in a giant wrestling match inside its own generator and lose by continuing to destroy its dipolarity and the source of vacuum energy faster than we allow it to power the load. It's the stupidest circuit that anybody could ever originate in powering systems.
Einstein wrote, so to speak, classical thermodynamics is the only theory of universal content concerning which I am convinced that within the framework of applicability of its basic concepts will never be overthrown. Now when statements like this get popularized, and these are probably the two most famous statements concerning the second law, there grows around the second law this mystique, which if you even question, you are pretty much thrown out or ostracized from science. And so what we're fighting as much as the difficulties of the experiment we're proposing is the second law of mystique, which is an invisible, self-imposed censorship that science has put upon itself about what it can speak about. Discharge, come back. Now, we have done a number of simulations which using realistic physical characteristics of silicon and p-n diodes, and we find that if you can match the time scale over which the electric field rebuilds, which we call the electrical time constant, which should be on the order of tens to hundreds of nanoseconds. If you match that time constant to the mechanical time constant of the spring, in other words, the normal resonant frequency of this cantilever, when you match these two, then you can set up what's called a resonant electromechanical oscillation, kind of like what happens when you push a kid on a swing. You hit them at the right frequency, you can build up the oscillation. Same way, you can use the electric field energy here to build up an oscillation in this hammer anvil and create a self-sustained oscillation. This can be demonstrated using today's technology. It doesn't require anything beyond which has already been developed. And, but again, it has to be built very small. The reasons being, the time constant for rebuilding this electric field are very short. The time constants are on the order of tens to hundreds of nanoseconds, which means that the frequencies associated with the mechanical oscillation have to be on the order of 1 to 10 megahertz, very high frequency, maybe even 100 megahertz. At those frequencies, you have to build the devices very small, otherwise they tear themselves apart by their mechanical accelerations. The chalkboard here is about 1.5 meters by about 5 meters. It's about 7.5 square meters. If it's absorbing 100 watts per square meter, you could get about 750 watts of power just from that blackboard sitting there. It would cool down slightly, but it could power everything else in this room.
Today we're demonstrating something mainstream science says is impossible. Taking a simple 12 volts DC input and charging a capacitor beyond 150,000 volts, yes, over 150 kV using an open system architecture. This breakthrough is made possible through our experimental Nevua prototype driver module, which taps into dynamics that conventional closed systems overlook entirely. This isn't just a trick of clever circuitry, it's the result of working with an open electric system where energy isn't strictly confined to the input-output model of closed systems. At the core of this demo is our experimental Nevua prototype driver module designed to interact with energy pathways often ignored in classical models. What you're about to see suggests the presence of excess energy flow, hinting at a new frontier in practical capable power design. What we're seeing may be the early signs of interaction with the active environment, often referred to as the vacuum in physics, or what we refer to as KOP, cost of operation of 1 plus behavior. This is the frontier where classical limits begin to blur. Let's take a moment to define something critical, what we mean by a closed-loop system versus an open-loop system in electrical design. Most traditional circuits are closed systems, a complete unbroken loop. In this model, when a power source like a battery is discharging, electrons flow from the negative terminal to the positive terminal. That's what we call electron flow, and it's the foundation of conventional electrical engineering. But here's the catch: in a closed-loop system, no component can ever rise above the energy level of the source itself. If your battery outputs 12 volts, that's your ceiling. No matter how clever your circuit is, you're stuck within that energy boundary. No additional energy enters the system. Everything is conserved, confined, and limited by that original input. Now contrast that with an open system, a design where the loop is intentionally disrupted or interacts with external fields or environments. This opens the door to energy exchange with the surroundings, including the possibility of tapping into vacuum fluctuations or other non-local effects. And that's where things start to get really interesting. Now let's talk about what makes our system different. This is an open system electrical design, and here's how it works in simple terms. Instead of keeping the energy locked into a tight loop like in a traditional circuit, we convert that input energy into a magnetic field, and then we leave that field open. That means we don't force the current to immediately loop back to the source. We allow the electric field to stretch out, to reach into the surrounding environment, interacting with what physics calls the vacuum. Think of it like this: in a closed circuit, you're trying to push current through a pipe. But in an open system, it's more like raising a sail. You're not pushing as much as you're catching. The field can couple with ambient potentials, and that interaction allows us to pull in additional energy. The result? Our 12-volt input doesn't stay trapped at 12 volts. Instead, the capacitor in our storage section gets charged to well over 1000 volts, and in some tests, much higher. This simply cannot happen in a conventional closed DC loop. That's the key difference and the heart of why open systems have such exciting potential. Picture this: rapid nanosecond pulses, a high-frequency noise train that charges our voltage stack faster than it leaks, ratcheting the voltage upward like pumping a swing at its peak. As it nears about 400 kilovolts, the breakdown point of a standard light bulb, it erupts in a lightning-like flash, unleashing intense, high-peak current arcs inside the bulb for a truly spectacular display. What you're seeing is proof of concept. Our open system couples with ambient fields, drawing in external energy and delivering net amplification once thought impossible. With further refinement, precise measurement, and rigorous research, we're laying the groundwork to revolutionize energy technology. This isn't just a demo, it's the blueprint for meeting tomorrow's energy challenges and unlocking a sustainable, abundant power future.